Detroit Allycat, welcome back to my channel. I'm really happy to have you here. We have a very interesting story to talk about, and I really owe it to one of my subscribers that she was like, hey, check out this case. It's really crazy. It's very interesting, and I think you would love it. So I wanted to give a shout out to her. So thank you, Carolyn330. I really appreciate you letting me find this case. Without further ado, let's get spooky. I know that a lot of you guys don't want to hear about like all the crazy side things that I have to tell you, but I'm gonna have to tell you some side things, so you're just gonna have to deal. This whole setup that I'm using is brand new, including the microphone. The camera I've had forever, but it's like this really intimidating camera, and I'm not quite sure how to use it yet. I apologize if something looks fuzzy or not right, or you can't see something. It is what it is, and that is what I have to tell you. Let's just jump into the case now that you understand that I might not look right or I might not sound right. Case I immediately gravitated towards because I could not believe that it was so similar to another case that I really gravitated towards. And a lot of people said that it's not like this case, but they don't know what they're talking about because it really is like this case. So the case that it's similar to is the Hatfields and McCoys. And the reason that I say it's very similar is about two families that really hated each other. And the reason that I gravitated towards this case is I'm actually related to the McCoys, which is kind of cool. My real name, it's not Allie. The full name is one of the famous McCoys that perished in the whole Hatfield and McCoys, like, their thing. And the McCoys were from Kentucky, and the Hatfields were actually from Virginia. And Virginia is right next to Ohio. And when I read about this case, I was like, wow, it's so similar. It really is, because both cases have love stories in them, and this case reminded me of that because there is a love story. And the case that I'm talking about is the Rhoden and Wagner family. And it all started with two people, Hannah and Jake Wagner. They had a child together, and her name was Sophia, and they were very much in love with each other. Everything that I read about Jake Wagner and Hannah was that they really were like in love, and like their families became very good friends, and them having a child together actually tied them together, and they both knew each other very well. Some time before the whole incident happened, I guess there was a falling out with Hannah and Jake, and apparently she ended up meeting somebody else and getting pregnant with another man's child. And from the different perspectives that I read, or the different people that accounted about this, they said that Jake was really sad, and he very much still wanted to be with Hannah, but it wasn't working out. The next thing that was like on his list was getting custody of Sophia, and like that just was a problem because both parents were kind of like not wanting the other one to have full custody, and I guess the joint custody didn't work. And what came next was really crazy. And there is so much speculation, and there's just so much stuff that isn't known about what happened because these people have not been convicted. Like, the trial has not happened, which is actually crazy to me too. But on the Rhoden family area, and I say area because they had property that, like, there was like 3 houses out there, and they were right next to each other, and the Rhodens all lived in these houses, or mostly all of them, partially some of them. And there was actually a camper that was attached to one of the houses, and Hannah lived with her mother and her 16-year-old brother, and then next door was her father, and I believe his brother was in there, and Hannah had another brother who had a girlfriend, and their 2 kids was in there, and then there was a camper on one of the property, and the cousin was in there. I might have got the cousin and the brother mixed up, but you kind of get the point. There were 8 of them on the property, and there were also 3 children, 1 5-day-old, 1 6-month-old, and 1 3-year-old. And in the middle of the night, we don't know what time, somebody came on the property and shot the entire family, execution style, and left the children. Like, did not kill the children, and left. And there was, like, no shell casings, no DNA evidence, no real evidence at all. Actually, it was done in such a way that they really couldn't tell you who did it. But they started putting things together, and all the things that happened afterwards were really just, it was weird, bizarre, twisted, crazy. There were so many pieces of, like, it was actually stated it was like a puzzle. They only got a piece of the puzzle at a time. And what else is really crazy is that the way that the county handled it was just, I believe it was very unprofessional. And I also believe that there might have been some cover-up. I'm going to tell you facts, but we are going to do a lot of speculation, especially because a lot of the accounts that I read, some of them were just wrong. They were wrong. And, like, while I was, like, listening to it and reading about it, I was like, wait a second, like, this can't be true. And the thing is that I'm just going to tell you this story. And what we're going to discuss is called the Piketon Massacre. And it was probably one of the worst shootings or murders in Ohio. It was one of the biggest investigations Ohio has ever had. Now, the thing about Piketon County, there's another city that's really close called Waverly, but it's a very rural area, and there's only like 2,000 people that live there, and I kind of like got the idea of it immediately because these areas are very much like where my family has come from, and so I kind of understand that whole like small town feeling, like we're safe here, we all know each other here, this is a great place to like raise our family. And when something like this happens, these communities take it very personally because they all feel like something has happened to shatter their safety. And that's exactly what happened when this occurred. Everybody got involved in this. So let's go through the fact. Let's talk about the 8 victims that were actually murdered. The first victim was Christopher Rhoden Sr. He was 40 years old. And the next person that was murdered was actually, I'm not going in order of how they were found. I'm going in like order of the family. The second victim is Dana Rhoden, and that's Christopher Rhoden's ex-wife. But from what I heard, they were still very good friends. And he actually ended up buying her a house next to him so she could live with next to him, and they can still be with their children and still be like a family unit. Which I'm going to tell you, honestly, I've never heard of anything like that. Like, people just I mean, they get along, but to live right next door to your ex. And Christopher and Dana had been together since high school. So it's pretty unusual, and it's kind of awesome. Christopher and Dana ended up having 3 children. The first child they had was Clarence Rhoden, and his middle, they called him Frankie. I'm guessing that's his middle name. The second one was Hannah Mae Rhoden, and the third one was Chris Rhoden Jr. So Frankie was 20, Hannah was 19, and Chris was 16. And then Clarence Frankie Rhoden actually was getting married to a girl named Hannah Hazel Gilly. And she was one of the victims too. So she was number 6. Christopher Rhoden's brother was there as well, Kenneth Rhoden, and he was the older brother, and he was 44. He was one of the victims. And then their cousin, Gary Rhoden, was in the camper, and he was one of the victims too. So that makes 8 people. Frankie Rhoden and Hannah Gilly actually had 2 children. They had Ruger and Brentley, and I'm not sure which one was the 6-month-old. I think it was Ruger, but I could be wrong about that. And then Hannah Mae Rhoden, she actually had 2 kids as well. She had Kylie, which was the 5-day-old, and she had Sophia, who was 2 years old. And this is at the time of all of the murders. So the kids are older now. Hannah Rhoden had Sophia with Jake Wagner. Now, this is the family that they suspected that actually went and murdered them. Let's talk about the Wagner family a little bit. The first person that we're going to talk about is George Billy Wagner. He's 47, and he was married to Angela Wagner, who was 48. And they had 2 children, which is Edward Jake Wagner, and the brother, or their son, George Wagner. The mothers of George Wagner and Angela Wagner. George Wagner had a mother. Her name was Frederica Wagner, and Angela Wagner had a mother, and her name was Rita Newcomb. When all of the suspects were charged, the 2 mothers of both George Wagner and Angela Wagner were actually charged as well. And they were charged with obstruction of justice. And we'll get into that in a minute, but I want to go through all of the details of what happened, why they think the Wagners did it, and where we are right now. Let's get back to Jake Wagner and Hannah Rhoden. When Jake Wagner was dating Hannah Rhoden, there were rumors of actual abuse happening in the relationship, that Hannah wasn't happy because she felt like she was being abused, and that, there were problems in the relationship. I couldn't find a lot about this. It was kind of like a hearsay type of thing, so I can't say that it's real evidence, but there is something that kind of is interesting. After the murders of the Rhoden family were committed, the Wagners packed up and they actually went to Alaska. And a lot of people are like, oh, that's a huge sign that they did it. But here's the thing. After the Rhoden family murders happened and the Wagners left for Alaska, a lot of the community, which I told you, communities like this are very, tied together. They all know each other. They're very aware of everything that happens to everybody. They started, kind of, and I don't want to say bullying the Wagners, but they were being very mean to them. There were stories about bottles being thrown at them, their cars being keyed. Everybody probably knew where they lived, so probably people were driving by, screaming things. For them to leave after something like that happened, and if they were innocent, I could probably see someone doing that. I mean, it doesn't look good, but at the same time, would you stay in a town where everybody hated you and you were just constantly having horrible things being said to you? And I'm not saying this trying to say that they are innocent or guilty. I'm just stating the facts that nobody would stick around a very small town where absolutely everyone hated you. And a fresh start would probably be what you would want. All of the Wagners went to Alaska and they ended up getting custody of Sophia, which is Jake Wagner's daughter. Part of the charges that were sent against them, because they said that they had custody of Sophia, but the custody papers were actually forged and they were signed by a notary, and it was done completely illegal, and it actually ended up being Angela Wagner's mother, Rita Newcomb, who did it. And that's part of the reason why, like, she was charged when they came back. And so they all went up to Alaska, and what's really crazy, this part is crazy to me, is that Jake ended up getting married while he was in Alaska, and her name was Elizabeth Arter. Now, there's not a lot known about Elizabeth Arter. It's the only thing that I read was that she felt like, she said that being married to Jake Wagner was hell on earth, that he was abusive, it was not a good situation. And I find that interesting because it's kind of what the impression I got from Hannah Rhoden, is she was kind of saying the same thing. So both of these things are very, like, hearsay, but it's very interesting to me to hear that, like, you've got two stories that kind of coincide with each other, but none of them can be, like, corroborated, because you really don't actually have, like, somebody, like, you're not hearing from the actual person. Hannah's no longer alive. Elizabeth Arter cannot be found. I don't know, like, I'm just being honest with you. That's the problem with this situation, is that a lot of the things that I found out were, like, they were what the community was saying. But there are some facts that need to be known, okay? The Rhoden family were known as very good people, very hardworking people, very, like, they were just very family oriented, and their family to them was everything. Now, here's the thing about living in a rural area like Ohio, which is very close to Kentucky. These places are very hard to make money in. Like, jobs are not, like, abundant like they are close to the city. It's just a harder way of living. It is. And it's just, you have to do what you got to do to make by. And a lot of people do that. On the Rhoden family property, when the police came there to investigate the murders, they found grows. And when I say grows, I mean marijuana growths. And a lot of people were like, oh, there's drugs. Marijuana is legal now, but obviously when it happened, it was not. I kind of have my own, like, feeling about, like, calling marijuana drugs, because I actually feel like alcohol is way more dangerous than marijuana. But regardless, there were a lot of marijuana plants being grown on their property, and it was enough to be called, like, there were drugs being run off the property. And the way that, like, they talked about it when the law enforcement was, like, on TV, I almost suspected that there was more than marijuana, but that was never said, so I can't prove that. But he just made it seem like there were, like, a lot of drugs involved, but the only thing that they talked about was marijuana. And the other thing that they said that the Rhodens were involved was cockfights. And a lot of people that read about the massacre, were like, I didn't even know that was a thing. It's a thing. It's a thing. The thing is that, like, the Rhodens were victims, and everything that happened to them was very horrible. The fact of the matter is that there were illegal activities taking place on the property. The reason I bring these things up is not to make the Rhodens look bad, but it's really to, like, tell you that they probably had a lot of people that came on that property. And that's important to know, because when these people were killed, they had pit bulls, and the thing about dogs is a lot of people are like, oh, well, the dogs would have alerted the family. That sounds great, like, in theory, but the truth of the matter is anybody that knows dogs, that are used to dogs, that are familiar with dogs, it's very easy to get a dog to calm down. Like, even pit bulls, Rottweilers, and Dobermans, like, seriously, like, the most vicious dogs in the world can be, like, contained. Like, all you really need is, like, some hot dogs, some steak, and the fact of the matter is, with the marijuana grow taking place on the property and the cockfighting happening, these dogs were probably around a lot of people. So it's possible that these dogs probably have smelled these people on the property before. And the more people you have on your property and the more socialized your dogs are, the less likely that they're going to be, like, jittery and, like, I don't know how to put it. It's I have a big dog. I've had my big dog around people, and you have big parties and you have a lot of people on your property, your dog's going to be less likely to freak out if somebody walks on your property because they're used to that, and that's just how it is. Now, that doesn't mean that, like, if they hear, like, a noise in the middle of the night, they're not going to bark, but if somebody, like, pulled up and they were like, hey, buddy, come here, and they, like, gave them, like, hot dogs and stuff, they're probably not going to bark. And the way that these murders were committed is they say, like, oh, they were professionals for all these reasons. The one thing that I found very odd was that they left the children alive. And, I mean, that kind of speaks about their character and what kind of people that they were. It's also kind of, like, chilling to think about it, because when Hannah Mae was murdered, when she was shot, her 5-day-old was in bed with her. And she was shot in bed, and the baby was just laying next to her dead body. It was like a mercy to leave the child alive, but how did they know that the baby was going to survive without their mother just laying in the bed? 5-day-old baby. And when they went to Gilly and Frankie's house, Hannah Gilly and Frankie's house, they left the 3-year-old and the 6-month-old alive. And I believe the 6-month-old was actually in bed with Hannah Gilly and Frankie Rhoden too. So, like, it's a mercy, but it's also very cold-hearted and matter-of-fact. Like, these children probably watched their parents being murdered, but they were so young they don't know what that was. And the other thing is that they said that silencers were used. And so let's talk about silencers. Like, there's this, like, misconception that you have to be, like, this technological person to make a silencer. That is absolutely untrue. Anybody who knows about firearms or can, like, Google how to make this can make a silencer. Like, silencers, they're not like the movies. I can tell you that right now. There's no, like, you watch the movies and you hear someone shoot, like, a firearm and you're just like, choop, choop. It doesn't work like that. Like, there can be, like, very advanced silencers, and then there can be, like really rough, like, literally, like, a pipe with stuff shoved in it to, like, silence the sound. Like, it's not hard to make. People make firearms on their own, and especially in these areas, like these very rural areas, like, firearms and knowledge of firearms, they're, like, secondhand nature. Especially, like, I grew up with firearms, and it's just, like, second nature to me. Like, I know about them. I know about, like, I wouldn't say silencers, but I know that it's not as hard to make as they made it sound. Like, they interviewed somebody and they were like, oh, that had to be somebody that was in the military, like a Navy SEAL. No, that's absolutely not true. That is not true. Like, seriously, a silencer could be made by like literally anyone who has the time to look up how to make it. And unfortunately, knowledge about how to destroy and murder people is everywhere. Like seriously everywhere. And that's just the facts of life, I guess. It's kind of sad, but it is. It's the truth. Like, they have a book called The Anarchist Cookbook, and you can read about how to make a pipe bomb. Like, it literally tells you, and it's so easy. So making a silencer would be no problem. I'm sure there's a book somewhere that will teach you how to make a silencer. If it's legal or it's not legal, it's out there. It's out there somewhere. I mean, if you look at the Rhoden family, they learned how to grow marijuana, and they learned how to have an illegal cockfight on their property. Like, that takes a little bit of planning. Like, how do you go around telling everybody, like, hey, we're fighting some angry chickens today, you know? So it's not abnormal that these people had silencers. And there's other weird, strange facts that I want to talk about. Some of the things that I heard was that, you know, Chris Rhoden Sr. and Billy Wagner actually ended up getting into a fight. I believe it was 6 months before their murders, and a lot of people were talking about it. But again, this is hearsay. Like, there's no one that can corroborate that. And the fact that they got into a fight does not mean the Wagner family actually killed the Rhoden family. It's just another piece of the puzzle. Something that was mentioned, and actually they are planning on using it in court, is that the Wagner family, had the movie Boondock Saints. And that's a movie about vigilante justice. And they had silencers in the movies. Like, okay, I get that. That's great. They watched Boondock Saints, but that's like, I wouldn't even call that circumstantial evidence. That's just a very popular movie, and there's hundreds of movies with silencers in them. I'm pretty sure if you're watching my video right now, you've seen a movie with a silencer. However, because we are on the topic of the silencers, the Wagner family, they moved out to Alaska, and I guess they lived there for like a year, and then they decided that they were going to come back home. Now, a lot of people said they were coming back home because they wanted to clear their name. That's not what I read. I read they were coming back home because they were having a very hard time making ends meet. And for people that aren't familiar with Alaska, that kind of makes a lot of sense, because if you read about Alaska, like produce, groceries, stuff like that, work is extremely hard to find in Alaska. Like, the cost of living is so high. And the reason for that is that just, like, there's not a lot of people in certain parts of Alaska. So they're not going to set up, like, a Walmart's or, like, a Kroger's where there's, like, 200 people living. And in Alaska, in certain areas, that's how it is. And so the Wagner family were coming back because they had left all kinds of property. You know, their mom still lived somewhat nearby. They wanted to, like, tie up loose ends, get some money, and their plan was to actually go back. The second that the Wagners left, actually the second that the Rhodens were murdered, the law enforcement started investigating their murders. And what they did was, when the Wagners went to go for Alaska, they went on the Wagner properties and they actually searched the properties. And I guess there was like a well on one of the horse farms that Jake and Billy Wagner owned. And they went and checked the well, which is very random. But in the bottom of the well, they found a homemade silencer. So that is real evidence, because now you have something that you can tie to the murders. And that's one thing that they found. The other thing is that the law enforcement has said that there was an informant that came forward and they were giving them information about the Wagner family, and that they committed the murders, and they think that this informant was actually part of the Wagner family, but they're not giving the name out, obviously, because it's going to affect the court. And then there is another piece of evidence. 4 months before the murders were committed, Angela Wagner went to a Walmart and bought a specific type of shoe for everybody. And the thing is the way that the Rhodens were found is Bobby Joe, which is Dana's sister, her husband came when Bobby Joe went. Okay, so Bobby Joe went to go feed the dogs in the morning because I guess the guys had to go to work. And Bobby Joe, she actually found Christopher Rhoden dead first. And then she called the police. And then after she called the police, she called her husband. And his name was James Manley, was her husband. And he wore a specific type of shoe with a specific tread. And the shoes that Angela Wagner bought, those were the shoes that James Manley wore all the time with a specific tread. And that was like kind of a really detailed piece of evidence. Like, I mean, that's very intricate if that's what happened. And they said that they found those tread marks inside Christopher Rhoden's house, and they were blood marks with these like shoe patterns on them. Obviously, Jake Wagner ended up getting custody of Sophia afterwards because he had his grandmother forge the custody documents, and his mother, Angela Wagner, told him to go ahead and set up a GoFundMe. And I guess that kind of like got the whole town like really riled up because he sets up this GoFundMe for him and his daughter. Now they have all these extra expenses, and it just didn't look good. And I guess it happened, he set up the GoFundMe like 6 days after it happened. And then something else that was tied to this is that, you know, Hannah Rhoden had made mention to one of her cousins that they were being watched by the Wagner family, which I thought was kind of odd. Like, how would they know they were being watched? But she said that they thought they were being watched for like up to 4 months prior, and that she suspected somewhere in the woodlines that there was cameras watching them. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's very bizarre. When the Wagners went to Alaska, they lived there for about a year. And after they got done living there for a year, they came back, like I said, because they couldn't afford to live there and they wanted to tie loose ends up. And their plan was to actually go back to Alaska when they were done. And I believe it was like 2 years after the murder, they returned and they came back to the town. And they pretty much were there for about 30 days until it was known, like, hey, everybody, like, the Wagners are back in town. And law enforcement ended up like arresting them. And when they were interviewed, they basically came out and they said, like, we have figured out who committed these heinous crimes, and it's the Wagner family. And they said that there were 332,000 pieces of evidence, and they haven't released what the evidence is. But I want to talk about that a little time. Properties, they were like double wides, like trailers. When these murders were committed, the sheriff actually ended up taking all 3 of these like trailers and they put them in this site, like this huge warehouse, and they locked it up and they kept it there. And everyone thought, oh wow, they're really doing an amazing job of investigating. And of course, friends of the Rhoden family are driving by. They're kind of looking, they're curious. You know, this is kind of like big news in such a small town. They start to notice that like the gate is open to where this evidence is. And then they start to notice that there's no one guarding the building where all the evidence is. And they figure out like anybody can go inside of this building and do whatever they want to these houses, which is crazy. But you have to remember, it's a very rural area. And to have somebody working there 24 hours a day, that's kind of a lot. I'm not saying that it's right, because there definitely should have been somebody there who was watching the evidence, the crime scenes, especially if they remove them, which I don't understand why they remove them from the property. Like, I feel like it would have been better to keep them there. I guess they might have been worried that somebody was going to go there and, like, mess with them and do all this stuff, but they picked up the houses and put them in a warehouse. And then something even crazier is the sheriff was indicted for, like, 14 counts of misconduct and, like, all kinds of these illegal dealings. And this was during the whole Rhoden murders and Wagner investigation, and, like, they hinted that he had something to do with a cover-up, and it was very, like, it was messed up. My heart goes out to the Rhodens, because, like, how are they gonna trust anything after, like, the sheriff is, like, indicted for doing, like, misconduct and doing all kinds of things? And, like, the case just seems like it's very, like, all over the place. Like, the evidence is all over the place. Like, the stories that are being told are all over the place. And what's even crazier is that when they arrested the Wagners, they arrested the Wagners, like, Billy Wagner's mother and Angela Wagner's mother. And that Billy Wagner's mother is kind of an interesting character. Her name is Frederica Wagner, and she owns, like, this, like, horse farm. And, you know, you hear, like, some of the family, their family, talking about her, and they're saying, like, she's a saint and she would never do anything wrong. And she basically was charged with, like, helping cover up these murders, which, by the way, she was released without any charges, been found innocent. But something that I did find kind of, like, worth talking about is there's other people that came forward and said stuff about Frederica, and basically she owned these houses, and they were, like, land contract houses, and she was known for, like, letting people that live there for a certain amount of time, and then, like, if they couldn't live up to their contract, then she basically, like, she kicked them out or whatever and got to keep the properties, which is very common, because land contracts are really horrible things. So if you don't know what a land contract is, it's like basically somebody owns a house, but you come up with an agreement with them saying that I'm going to give you money like it's a mortgage, and I'm going to do everything to fix up this house, and at the end of the time that I get done paying you for this, then this is my house. I have never seen a land contract actually work. Ever. They always go bad, because, I mean, you're not paying a mortgage company, you're paying an individual, and the person that owns the properties ends up doing really well, because they don't have to, like, fix the house up like you would with a rental, because with a land contract, the person that's living there is taking that responsibility. And so it's just like I don't want to say shady, but it's just not a good deal. Like, land contracts are not a good deal. But if you had really bad credit and you want to own a house and you're desperate, you're going to try to do a land contract. And Frederica Wagner was known for doing land contracts, and a lot of people said that she was really mean and she was really cold. She was hard to deal with. But then you have people on this side saying she's, like, this great woman that lives by the cross, and she taught Sunday school, and she would give you, like, the shirt off her back, and it's a lot of speculation and, like, hearsay and stories and stuff. And then you have Angela Wagner's mother, Rita, got charged with actually forging the custody papers, notarizing it so it was a legal document, and she got charged with, like, all kinds of stuff, and then she pled down to a misdemeanor, and I believe it was obstruction of justice or something like that. But she basically admitted, like, hey, I did this. And then she went up on stand and she said, I decided to tell the truth because I thought it was the right thing to do. I feel like she decided to tell the truth because she didn't want to go to prison for a felony. People said that the Wagners purchased bulletproof vests, and they did. They did purchase bulletproof vests, but they purchased bulletproof vests 4 months after the Rhodens were murdered. And they could actually prove that through Amazon, I guess. I have never seen bulletproof vests on Amazon, but apparently that's what one of the Wagner's family members said. They had proof, they had evidence, and they had the receipts for that. So that's just like another like piece of information that I found was really strange. The whole case is kind of strange, and we really don't know what the truth is because it hasn't gone to court. Usually when I do something like of this size, I do it after it's gone to court and I know what's the truth and who really did it and like all the evidence is presented. But at this point, it's just like a lot of circumstantial evidence and a lot of hearsay. What I think and what I feel is that the Wagners had something to do with it. And I don't know, like, I can't say that for sure, but I have heard that like Angela Wagner really wanted to have Jake Wagner have custody of Sophia, and that was like a big deal to her, that she loved her grandchildren and she wanted her grandchild with them, which any grandmother's going to be like that. Well, not any, but most grandmothers are going to be like that. And it's very tragic when I think about like the fact that somebody went in, they knew the dogs, they knew the land, they knew whose houses were there. They completely executed an entire family. Like, an entire family, 8 people, and they left the children alive. That is such a rare occurrence. Like, I've never heard of that happening, really, ever. Except, what's really strange, 6 months after the Rhoden family were murdered, there was a couple in Kentucky, and they were executed the same way, and their children were left alive. And what is interesting is when they did arrest all of the Wagners, like, I think Jake and his brother George, they were in a car together. Angela Wagner was at her house, but the father, George Billy Wagner, he was actually in Kentucky. That's kind of a coincidence, you know, that there was another couple in Kentucky, and these people are suspected of killing the Rhodens in a specific type of way, and these people in Kentucky were killed in this specific type of way. However, law enforcement said that there is no way that they're connected, which is, I don't know. It sounds like law enforcement has their like hands full with this case, and I really hope that they kind of get it together, because I can only imagine what the Rhoden family is going through and how horrible it is. And I like looked at all the pictures of the Rhoden family, and it was really tragic, because I mean 5 of them were like under 20. Hannah Hazel Gilly was 20 years old. Frankie Rhoden was 20 years old. Chris Rhoden Jr. was 16, and Hannah Mae Rhoden was 19. So that's four people that were killed that are under the ages of 20 years old. And that to me is like, those are babies. And talking about babies, the children that were left alive, they were left alive, but they were left alive with a legacy of a massacre. Like, they don't have parents, they don't have grandparents, they don't have aunts. They do have some family, because there's obviously some Rhodens left in the area because they interviewed them, but not like they did. Chris Rhoden's brother, Kenneth Rhoden, he had kids of his own, and you know, one of his kids was supposed to go over to the Rhoden properties and actually spend the night, but she couldn't for whatever reason. I believe her boyfriend had a bad tooth, or her ex-partner the father child had a tooth problem and she had to turn around and go back. And, you know, can you imagine being her, finding out like the whole family was massacred and she was almost there that night? That's the Piketon County massacres, and I'll be very curious to see what happens when the court case comes up. And just before I let you go, I just want to talk about this one tiny thing that kind of bothered me. The Rhodens were massacred in 2016. They have not had a court date yet. And that is crazy to me because the Wagners were arrested in 2018. And I guess they waived their right to a speedy trial, but to be in jail or prison for 2 years without a conviction, that's like really weird. Like really, really weird. And like one other thing is that like when they were talking, like a lot of the media outlets were talking about like the Rhoden massacre, they were making the people sound like in that the Piketon area like they were hillbillies and rednecks and like all these things, like saying all these horrible things. Like, please do not say stuff like that. These are normal people that live in these communities, and this probably devastated their community and shook everything up. And so to have like insult to injury is just like really wrong. And a lot of people that live near the city or in the city, we all have family out in those rural areas, and those people are good people. They're hardworking people, and a lot of them can survive way more than the city folk can. Just saying. And so that's my 2 cents and some of the like mystery and craziness of the story. I hope that I kind of tied it together. It just went so many different directions and it was so like all over the place, and I hope I did a decent job explaining it. If you like this story, give me a thumbs up. Tell me what you think. Do you know the Rhodens? Do you know the Wagners? Do you live in that area? Do you know something that I don't know? I'd love to hear about that. Have a beautiful night. Thank you so much for watching. I can't wait to put this video together because it's going to be really interesting. Anyway, stay safe and stay spooky. Bye.